This week on the Red Sneaker Writers Podcast.
Sit down and write. What I mean is forget, and I will call it the production value. Forget the warm-up. Forget the bullpen. Forget the waiting for the desire. Wait for whatever it is you need to wait for before you sit and write. Just actually sit down and just start typing.
Welcome to the Red Sneaker Writers Podcast. News, interviews, and writing tips for people who are serious about having a writing career and want some practical knowledge to help them achieve it. Your host is the nationally best-selling author of more than 50 books, William Bernhardt.
Hello, sneakers. Apologies for the delayed arrival of this episode, but better late than never, especially when you have a guest of the caliber that I have today. We finished the small group writing retreat in Eureka Springs. Absolutely one of the best retreats with the best writers I've ever had the pleasure of leading. So now my attention is 100% focused on WriterCon, our annual writers conference held over Labor Day weekend, September 3rd to 6th. This year's conference will be the biggest we've had yet, with more speakers, more agents, more editors than we've ever had. Remember, even if you can't come to Oklahoma City in person, you can stream the entire conference, and all sessions will be available to all registered guests online for a month after the conference. So please check out the schedule on our website, writercon.org. That's WRITERCON.org, and see if this conference wouldn't boost your writing career. You can attend over 80 sessions, you can meet privately with agents and editors, enter contests, and as if you needed any additional reasons to attend, Jesse, you're going to be there, aren't you?
I am going to be there. If you're interested in how to turn your book into an audiobook or to use podcasting as a medium to engage with your fans and, of course, sell more books, I will be presenting on both of those.
Those of you who listen to this podcast regularly know Jesse is my co-host and sound engineer, but he is also, he does all facets of audio, including audiobooks, which I know a lot of writers are trying to break into right now, and for good reason. It's a boom market. So one more reason to attend WriterCon. My special interview guest today is Barry Friedman. Barry has worked for decades as a stand-up comic, traveling all over the world, appearing in prestige venues like Vegas and the Bahamas. He's also the author of several books, including a memoir, 4 Days and a Year Later, and his latest effort, a collection of humorous essays, mostly humorous, we'll talk about that later, a collection of essays titled The Joke Was on Me. I cannot wait to talk to my writing buddy, but first, the news.
Yeah.
As you may already know, Kindle Vela is now open to readers. This is Amazon's serialized storytelling platform. The first 3 episodes of any story are free, but after that, readers have to use virtual tokens, which of course you buy with normal currency, to unlock more installments. Readers are given 200 free tokens to start, so it's basically like a reading version of Dave and Buster's. But, they're hoping you'll get hooked on the story, obviously. Once you're following a story, every time a new episode is released, you'll get notified. They're primarily focusing on genre fiction, but there's some nonfiction there too, and a lot of big names like New York Times bestselling author Audrey Carlin or science fiction author Hugh Howey, who, of course, was one of the big breakthrough authors in the world of ebook-only fiction. He's writing a memoir. Thriller author C.G. Cooper is there. Right now, Rebecca Zanetti's story, Wolf, which is a shifter romance, is currently the most favorited story with 37 episodes so far. But what you really want to know, of course, is, Bill, do you have a story up there? Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I do. It's called The Idea Man. And you don't have to worry about me not finishing it because I've already finished it, but we're releasing it one installment at a time, which I think is kind of fun, actually. It's reminiscent of, the 19th century, Dickens and Trollope and those guys. And The Idea Man involves, where did I get this idea? A thriller writer who gets into trouble because you see there's this group of villainous terrorist types who are trying to steal a super weapon, but they know it will be hard because it's very protected. They know they've got to concoct some outrageously clever scheme. Well, who is better at plotting schemes than a thriller writer? And maybe you can see where the story is going from there. This whole Amazon Vela thing is kind of an odd experiment. Just ignore the man behind the curtain or the falling lights. I'm not sure if Amazon truly believes that serialized storytelling will take off. I mean, they've done this before. They had Kindle Stories and they had Kindle Serials. Maybe the whole thing is just to introduce this tokens business, and this will be the start of Amazon's own new digital cryptocurrency. But what distinguishes this effort is that it's meant to be read on phones. It's even formatted for phones and to create a sort of Amazon social media environment. Authors can post personal comments at the end of each segment, and readers can post comments about what they just read, much like you might do on Twitter or Instagram. I don't know. Jesse, what do you think? Are you going to start reading stories in increments on your phone?
Well, weirdly enough, the phone part is what bothers me the most. If I could read these on my Kindle, of which I've bought many Kindles from Amazon, so I feel like they owe me something. I do like the idea of, if there's a way for authors to get their work to me faster, then especially for like the fantasy type of stories I read,
right?
I would love that. And it is sort of a return to the paid by the word novels of the 19th century. And I'm all for it. I'm not necessarily a fan of Amazon's new currency system of it, because I don't think that really helps the authors that much. And I don't know how the authors get paid. Maybe you can tell me. But I'm not against this idea.
The tokens thing, I mean, it's so complex. Why? That's why I was saying there must be some reason. Did they think it'll be like, getting poker chips at Vegas and you stop remembering that you're actually spending money?
I think, the only reason to use tokens is to hide the fact of how much the thing actually costs. And so I don't know how long Amazon thinks they can keep that a secret. But
and some people would say it's like Wattpad, except you have to pay for it, because clearly some people are just writing, I finished mine, but some people are clearly writing a chapter and posting it, and then someday after it's all finished, they might publish it as a book. But now you're kind of getting to see the story as it develops, which I suppose is perhaps fun for some people.
Yeah, I mean, I would love it if an author kept reposting the same chapter as they're fixing it, and you could sort of see the process.
Multiple drafts.
Yeah, I'd like that.
What a great idea! I'll suggest that to Amazon if they ever ask.
Trademarked.
It's unlikely to happen. I don't know exactly how they're paying authors. I know you're supposed to get a cut of what it makes, but how that breaks down in tokens and everything, I have no idea.
Are you going to get paid in tokens?
Statement. What?
Are you going to get paid in tokens?
So that would be the ultimate not good. I don't know. Once I get my first royalty statement, I'll report back. Okay, news item number 2. Kids, let's go to Storyville. They're looking for investors for Storyville Gardens, which is a book-based theme park meant to encourage reading by bringing childhood favorites to life through literary-inspired attractions. So it's like Six Flags over Sense and Sensibility or something like that. The park is planned for Nashville, Tennessee, with a projected opening date of spring 2025. So if you're looking for something to invest your money in, go to the Storyville Gardens website. They'll be very glad to see you. Final news item, which, big surprise, also involves Amazon. Amazon has suspended hundreds, and I mean hundreds, of top Chinese sellers of goods on Marketplace. This story on their marketplace, this story comes from Marketplace Pulse, which is reporting that Amazon is actually enforcing its own rules. They've had rules against manipulating customer reviews, adding and subtracting and posting fake ones or getting somebody to do it, but they have not been much enforced until now. And in fact, in the wake of this, a few of the suspended sellers have already announced layoffs or even bankruptcies. Amazon said last year that they, quote, stopped more than 200 million suspected fake reviews before they were even seen by a customer, end quote. The suspended brands apparently relied on illegal tactics to get ahead of the competition. They didn't really outwit this system. They sort of cheated it, but I know in many cases they felt, well, everybody else is doing it, so we're going to have to do it too in order to compete. So arguably, you could blame Amazon's ineffective oversight, but at any rate, it may not work in the future. They're enforcing those rules now, so maybe now everyone will have to play by the same rules, which will make all those online reviews you read far more reliable. Wow. After all that somber news, I think I need a good laugh or a good book. And today's interview guest can provide us with both. Barry Friedman. Barry Friedman, are you with us?
I am.
Very good to see you.
Good to see you. Are we on?
We are actually Realio Trulio on. Okay, for a traditional first question, if you could give a writer one piece of advice, just one, and you hold workshops regularly, so you probably have more than one. But if you had to narrow it down to one piece of advice, what would it be?
Sit down and write.
Good advice. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is forget, and I will call it the production value. Forget the warm-up, forget the bullpen, forget the waiting for the desire, wait for whatever it is you need to wait for before you sit and write. Just actually sit down and just start typing. Mm-hmm. And later on, you can edit it, and later on, you can mold it and fix it. But the first thing you have to do is actually get it down somewhere. And I think writers, by and large, spend way too much time trying to get the rest of the environment right before they write. And I think at some point, you just sit down and do it. It's like losing weight. Stop eating.
Yeah. Well, what's your process like? I mean, do you make yourself sit down and write every day, or what happens?
Actually, this is going to sound hypocritical. I don't. And the reason I'm going to say that is if you look at your product, if you look at your output, right? And for instance, if you're Bob Dylan and you write Mr. Tambourine Man on Monday, you can take the rest of the week off. But
no, write every day.
Right. But if you've been working on a novel, let's say for 5 or 10 years, and you only have 100 pages, clearly your system's not working. So depending on what your output is, depending on whether you need to wait from the light from the heavens to motivate you to write, or whether you have a schedule, look to see again what you produce. And that's, I think, will be your guide going forward. I mean, for me personally, I had this conversation with my daughter the other day, and she said, you don't ever write. And Bill, I probably asked you the same question. Do you ever write just to write? Just as a release, as a medicinal? No. And amazingly, how many people?
I do write poetry, which is never going to make me rich. So I'll give you that.
But most things you write, will wind up somewhere.
Right. Published.
Right. And most of the things I write, I know will wind up somewhere. So if I sit down and write something about politics, I know it's going to wind up in a blog or a post or some political place. And same thing with the novels and the essays. So I don't write just to write, but there's always some place to write for and something to write for them. So that's how I do it. Like, for instance, I do write, without knowing anything about the topic, I do write for a geology magazine, which is great because I always know it's going to show up somewhere. So I guess I am going to be published. And so I write for them, and I write the political stuff, and I write the blogs, and I write, obviously, the books. So I don't write unless there's some place for it to go and some reason to do it.
Now, did that come out of your deep and abiding love for geology, or what are we talking about here?
Well, you need to make a living, and a good dear friend of mine was an editor of the AAPG Explorer magazine, and he said, "You can write. Why don't you just write for us?" And I said, "Well, is the hang up that I know nothing about petroleum geology?" He said, "Yes and no." So thank God for cut and paste. You do these interviews online with these geologists, and you ask them these technical questions, and you just take it and put it there. And he said this, and further on, he said this, and the conference will be held here. And it's a puzzle I put together. And what I love about the geology writing is, unlike everything else I do, I'm not invested in it as much. And so if I write something and you edit and you say to me, "Barry, we needed to change this first paragraph, it's just not going anywhere," you and I might have a discussion about it. Well, in geology, it's like, we had to change your lead. Who cares? I didn't even read it. So there was a certain, and I like being detached from some of the writing I do. I don't want to be invested in all of it. I think you get some value about writing things that aren't important to you, because you do keep a certain perspective and objectivity to it. And you stay more with the story than you do with the emotion or with your motivation. So it's a good exercise to write about stuff you don't care about.
So at this point, you've written a lot of different things, at least some of which I know you care about. You've written a lot of short humor pieces.
Right.
You've written a memoir. You're about to come out with a novel. And I think after that, you've told me, is a collection of, anecdotes, stories about your father. How do you decide what your next project's going to be?
That just comes to you in the middle of the night. I want to do this next, or someone will say something to you. And the book about my father, which will be just me sort of taking care of my father the last 10 years since he moved from Vegas, or in his mind, since I dragged him from Vegas to Tulsa, will just be about the relationship between my father and me and this 94-year-old man who's always pushing 100, and how you sort of maneuver that relationship. And again, it's the specifics of the dynamic between us and fathers and sons generally. And, when I've been writing this on Facebook, posting stories about him for years, and probably the most popular thing I write is the stuff about my father. And so at some point you think, well, why don't I just turn that into a book, since people seem to be reading it? In terms of the other stuff, and we've talked about this before, Bill, the whole thing about nonfiction and memoir is, at every moment you have to think when you're writing memoir, why would anybody care?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I don't really know the answer to that, except when it comes to memoir. Good, I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, there should be a takeaway. That's what you're saying. Something, of course it's important to you. It's your story, but what's there for everybody else?
Right. And unless you're famous, when everybody will care about you, unless you've had an incredible story, like you were kidnapped and held hostage for a year, people will want to read that. Well, the third reason people will read your memoir, it's a really good written book. It's a well-written, you have to write well, and you have to write that people care about it. And so in my case, the book I wrote about my son and the 5 days after he died, it's like, well, a lot of people experience death. Why would anybody care about my son's death and my reaction to my son's death? And you don't want to ask yourself those questions. And if you're in a writing workshop, you don't want anybody asking you about those questions. But I think that is the question that needs to be asked is, why would anybody care about what you're writing?
Your most recent book is The Joke Was on Me, which is a collection of shorter pieces, right? Where'd that come from?
Well, as you know, it came from the wellspring of the first book I wrote that you published, Road Comic. And it was about my 20 years in doing stand-up comedy, the first 20 years doing stand-up comedy. And when you had suggested that maybe it's time for that to be re-released, I thought, well, let me look at Road Comic from a view of 20 years later, right? So instead of just editing Road Comic, I decided to rewrite it. And take out a lot of the gratuitous debauchery and just leave the debauchery.
Those were the best parts.
Right. Well, yeah. And I was going to actually call it, road comic, the apology, but I think you talked me out of that. But it was sort of like meta once removed, because in the first book, road comic, I saw myself living that life of being a stand-up comedian. So now I'm writing about watching myself 20 years ago.
Wow.
And you pull the lens back, so you get a better perspective. And the other thing is, and I think you would probably agree with this, at least I hope you would. I mean, I'm a better writer now than I was 20 years ago. So you write better. And I wanted to write this book better than I wrote it, because there are a lot of problems with the first book. And I think it is a better book. Now, the question I keep asking myself is, was it necessary? Would anybody care? Well, let's assume that people are not going to read road comic and then read The Joke Was on Me. But if they read The Joke Was on Me, they will get the essence of road comic, without quite so many misspellings and gratuitous debauchery, I guess.
That's really, really interesting to me. On the last podcast, of course, we had Gary Braver. Jesse will remember this. He talked about having a chance to republish his early thrillers and edit them. And he said that he took about 17,000 words out of each book. I thought, but they're better now because he's a more mature writer. And I thought, first I thought, I will never reread my early work. I like to think I'm a better writer now, but I'm not going to prove it one way or another. I'll just stay away. But I think that would be horrifying to go back and read everything that you wrote a long time ago.
It is. And you think, being a stand-up comedian, it's like sometimes you go on stage of a lousy show. And it's good to remind yourself that even though you're having a lousy show, you're still funnier than 95% of the people in the audience. Right. And so road comic is still probably a pretty good book, and still probably worth reading. And so, it is somewhat indulgent to think I want to make this, rather than being 60% effective, I want to make it 80% effective. But especially when you write memoir and you write your own story and you write about people in your life who you think deserve better. I mean, I actually spoke to somebody in road comic, and I apologized to her for the way I depicted the relationship. And she said, no, she goes, that was fine. She goes, I didn't really mind it. She goes, all things considered, I pretty much regretted the entire relationship. And I thought, wow. Right. And so you think, well, you do affect people even on that level. And I thought, well, you got to be careful then with how you do this. Because anytime you write memoir, it's like nobody asked to be in your story. And I don't know what you do about that. I mean, either you don't write or you be honest. And it's that great line in the movie Absence of Malice is, you know how not to hurt people and you know how to tell the truth, but I don't know how to do both at the same time. And that's always been the struggle for me with these books.
What a horrifying thought. What if everyone you knew decided to write a memoir? And of course you would be in it.
Yeah.
I don't mean just you. I mean, but especially you, but I meant everybody across the board.
I guess on a serious matter there, when my daughter read 4 Days and a Year Later, the book about her brother, my son, we talked about how neither one of her mother and my first wife didn't want to read the book, Paul's mother. And Nina said to me, it is because we were all there. And now we are reading Barry, Dad. She goes, your narrative, your story. And we all have narratives. We all have stories from that weekend. And now everybody is going to read yours. And we feel a little bit like it was stolen, like it was our story too. And now you're telling it. Now, the cheap answer is, well, then write your own damn book. But the real answer is, yeah, that is true, right? You write about our relationship, Bill. It's now your narrative. And I may have something to say about it, and I may not like your take. But again, your answer should be tough. I wrote it. It was the David Sedaris line when he was having Thanksgiving dinner one time with his sister, and one of the sisters, not Amy, they're all sitting around having Thanksgiving dinner, and I think the father said something crazy or insane, and the sister looked at Sedaris and said, "Don't you dare write about this." And he looked at her and said, "Why? It's not like you're going to do anything with it."
All right. Here's a tough question.
All right.
You've just
And by the
said,
way, I want to thank you for having me on, because you have like real writers on. So I want to thank you for having me on. Real authors.
Always a pleasure talking to you. You've been on the podcast before, for that matter.
I have.
So.
Yeah, I have.
And now we're all being distracted by Jesse's cat, who looks a lot like my cat, Bustifer. What's his name, Jesse?
His name is Smog.
Like the dragon?
Mm-hmm.
So what a legacy to live up to.
I know. Well, he is the destroyer of all things.
This is why when you're an actor, you never want to be on stage with a cat, because they get
That's right.
Kids,
No way.
For Bill's Tolkien fans, I know he is referred to as the chiefest and greatest of all calamities. So don't at Will or me.
That makes sense.
Smog titles.
Okay, back to the hard question, Barry.
All right.
You said you think you're a better writer now than you were 20 years ago. Why? What have you learned along the way? What lessons have you acquired?
Two things. I would imagine just a better control of the English language. I mean, it's like playing tennis for 20 years. You do get better at the game.
You'd like to think.
Yeah, you'd like to think, right? And
one would hope.
Yeah, the other thing, you get better at just that question of what does a reader, what do you think a reader wants to know or will benefit from, right? And in writing about my father every day or every other day, it hit me that my takeaway from my events with my father are not nearly as important as what my father does. I mean, it's what you say every workshop I've ever been with you, and even before that, which is show, don't tell.
Right.
And so I think you get better at showing the moment and getting out of the way. I think if I'm better at any writing, it's getting out of the way of the story I'm telling and not making the point, look at me, react to this moment. Right. You say to the reader, you react to the moment, here it is. I mean, it's going to be subjective, and you're going to react to the facts that I give you and the story I choose to tell. But I think getting out of the way, getting out of your own way, I think is maybe what I'm better at doing.
Sure. So your next project will be a novel, which, as far as I know, is your first formal attempt at fiction. I mean, you've always used fictional fictional devices, dialogue and whatnot in your writing, but this is the first flat out novel, right?
Right.
What inspired you to attempt this?
I've been wrestling with this whole business about verisimilitude for years, right? And the whole business about your truth and your version of it and stuff. And so I was thinking that, in the self-conscious universe that most of us now live in, right? We see ourselves in every situation. It's like there's a studio audience following us around, or maybe I feel that way, right? And so I decided, how would it be if you had the chance to recreate your entire life, but you had to use all the pieces in your life? Could you make it any better? Mm-hmm. Or would those pieces in your life have their own lives and go on the way they would in reality, your version of reality? So I decided to write a book about a writer in a bad marriage who decides to write a book about a writer in a bad marriage. Now, his name is Jacob Fishman. He's married to Cindy Fishman. He decides to call his characters Jacob and Cindy Fishman. So I am writing a book about Jacob Fishman, writing a book about Jacob Fishman. So you literally have two novels going on at the same time. Neither one is real, but the first one is realer, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the whole point of it is you see these two marriages going on, And will they both work or will they both not work? And does it even matter where one ends and the fictional one begins? Because they're both fiction anyway. But the whole business is we see ourselves in life. Can we get out of our own ways to actually live our life? Or is every moment going to be about, look at me in this marriage, look at me on vacation with my kids, look at me doing this, look at me being a father, a son, whatever. And I thought it might be good to explore that. Mm-hmm. However, the business of why would anybody care comes up a lot, because now it really is an kind of internal, convoluted, this is me thinking about me, and the old joke about, I'm tired of talking about me. Let's talk about you. What do you think of me? I mean, the self world just really has been on my mind a lot, and how that sort of ripples out through everything we do is and going back to road comic, and the joke was on me. Some woman said to me at one point, you don't let a lot of moments go by. And every moment seems to be sort of needs to be out there and reviewed and resonated. And so that was why I decided to write it, to try to explore the whole business of self-consciousness and verisimilitude.
That's fascinating. Very many levels of metatextuality.
Exactly.
Ultimately coming back to you.
Yeah.
Which arguably all fiction does, of course. But, you've got these memoirs and you got this novel. Is it hard to write so openly about yourself and your life?
No. It just seems to me that it probably should be, and I'm glad when I get comments that I'm tougher on myself in these books than I am anybody else, which lets me know that at least I'm playing fair, at least to that level, that I'm not coming across. I mean, I think John Woolley, our dear friend, said to me when he read The Joke Was on Me, he goes, man, I'm all for self-criticism, but Jiminy Christmas, lighten up, right? I think that's good that I am hard on myself. But of course, if you're hard on yourself and you see yourself being hard on yourself, how hard on yourself are you being? And it's the question of, does any moment count if you see the moment happening? And that's also explored in this book. I mean, I love the Norman Mailer quote. And Jesse, if you have to clean it up, you have to clean it up. But the Norman Mailer quote about fiction is bullshit. It's all nonfiction. I love that line.
Which I think is true, at least most of the time. Or I take one step further and say, if it ever comes to the point when it isn't, like you're really not bringing anything to the party, you're just writing a story because you got to write a story, it's time to quit, maybe.
I think so. There has to be some tentacle, right? Some tether to the reality. I mean, even science fiction, right? Even the relationships. I mean, I can't watch Star Wars, but I mean, I can see some of those relationships are actual, in Star Trek, right? When that moment, I guess everybody talks about when, I guess, Spock looks up and says to Kirk, he calls him friend. I mean, whatever that moment was, I mean, that's real, right? I mean, and those two guys had a friendship,
right?
And they didn't have to have a friendship, but you could see that connection. And that connection is really what's always been important to me, is how we characterize that business, right? And in my case, how we see ourselves characterize that moment, those moments.
I think that also relates to fiction and the idea of character arc and the many journeys that characters go on. Sometimes when people are writing series characters, which you haven't done, but that'll probably be next, several projects down the line. And some people are teaching, well, there's no character arc or series character because you want them to be the exact same every book. And I teach exactly the same. I can't think of anything more boring than a book where the protagonist undergoes nothing really, does not change. What I teach instead is, hey, we all go on many character journeys in our lives. We are on many heroes' journeys or trips. You just got to find a new one. And at this point, I've written 55 books, most of those novels, but I never have to think very hard before I realize, oh yeah, I'm actually writing about,
Right.
this thing I've plucked out of my life.
Well, and talk about the character arc. I mean, of course they have to grow and change. I mean, in cinema, the last 50 years, probably the greatest example of that character arc would be Michael Corleone, right? One of the reasons Al Pacino is so brilliant is from you think about when you first meet Michael in Godfather 1 to Godfather 3, you talk about a character arc.
Right.
Is there anything about him that stays the same? Of course it changes, right?
No, classic corruption tale, at least in the first one. After that, we could talk all night, but probably won't. Okay, I saw you sort of smile when I talked about you writing a series character in the future. What is in the future? Where do you think you're going at some point in this wild and crazy? I know, during the lockdown, of course, there was a lot less stand-up comedy going on, so you've perhaps had more time to think about your writing. Where do you see this going?
Well, actually, during the lockdown, I lost some weight and finished the 2 books, so it wasn't a complete waste.
That's not the worst thing, yeah.
I think we'll see how the novel does, and then the book about my father, and then after that, I don't know that I'm done with novels, I'm done with fiction, but I think after that, I do, and I say this, but I do want to get away from me.
At least not quite so obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I believe me. I'm as tired of me as perhaps you two are, if not more. So I think if I could, that's why I actually like writing about politics, because I can use some of the comedy, but it's not about me really, and I do like straight reporting. So I think after the book about my father, I don't know exactly, maybe a collection of essays about politics in the world and
I could see that being terrific. I could see you as a political columnist. You just need a paper, perhaps in a state that has a less conservative bent, perhaps.
Yeah. A good friend of mine said that, and a great piece of advice, and I guess you could say this about any kind of writing in any of the genres, but he said, if you're going to write about politics, you have to be more than just outraged. I mean, everybody's outraged. So if you're just going to add to the outrage, it's okay, it's another voice, and it could be a good voice, but everybody's outraged. So what's your angle? What's your contribution to the art? What's your contribution to the genre? And in my case, he said, you've got some comic background. You do know how to write funny. You are political. So see if you can combine those and don't. So if, in those days, he goes, if Trump does something and everybody's outraged about it, keep in mind that everybody's outraged about it. Now, what are you going to say that hasn't been said over and over again? I mean, I do some political commentary or just commentary on KWGS here in Tulsa. And Rich Fisher once, who's the executive director here, he said, Barry, the problem with doing commentary is by the time you talk about Trump, for instance, you're the 17th voice people have heard. So if you're going to be the 17th voice someone has heard, at least be a fresh voice.
Yeah, right.
So that's, I guess, the political goal, and my political goal in writing is how do you come up with something fresh?
Cool. Well, that's always the challenge, isn't it? Barry, I know a lot of people listening to this are writing and aspiring to publish and, impressed that you've had several careers and published several books. What advice would you give to people who are still in that pre-published stage of their writing career?
Boy, this. I mean, if we all knew the answer to that question, right? But I think what I'm detecting from people is this notion of writing a lot, right? And I don't know how you feel, but I think we shouldn't view writing in terms of weight. Right. I don't think if you're going to write a series, I think that's great. But I think you need to make the first book the best book.
Right.
I think you need to flesh out all those things that need to, and stop about third, fourth, fifth, sixth book. And it's like the first book is what matters.
Right. Well, if the first book flops, there is no series.
Right. And if the first book doesn't get published, there's no series. And your Ben Kincaid stuff and your Daniel Pike stuff. I mean, the first one is the one that mattered. Now, you may be able to write them faster now, but you didn't write the first Kincaid book in 6 weeks, did you?
No, more like 3 years.
Yeah. Now,
but I was practicing as an attorney full time then. So
right. But I guess the series you can write, the second, third, fourth one, but that first one is the one that matters. And I think, without obsessing to the point where you're paralyzed, I think if you are trying to get published, make sure that what you are trying to get published in and of itself is terrible cliche, is as good as you can do. Because I don't think anybody can buy, I don't think anybody's going to buy the fact, well, in the third and fourth book, he gets really interesting. Well, okay, great.
Which we've both heard at workshops before. And
yeah. Or I used to hear in comedy, you talk to a comedian who said, well, what'd you think of my set? And go, well, this whole first part here didn't work anywhere. There was no punchline. There was no setup. There was no thing. And he would say to me, comics would say to me, well, that part isn't supposed to be funny. Well, go listen, you're a comedian. It'd be a really good thing if it was funny, right? And so for writers, it's like, well, okay, he could get interesting, but we need him to be interesting now.
Yeah.
But I think part of the problem is people want to sell and they want to be successful writers.
Well, I think you're right. People talk about marketing and, platforms and getting all of which is good, but fundamentally, the first thing on your list has to be write something really strong. Yeah.
This notion that doesn't matter anymore just isn't the case. I mean, quality does matter. The rest of it's out there, right? Mm-hmm. But that still is the only thing you can control, is how good it is. Mm-hmm. And at that, once it's written, then, okay, so now we have to figure out how to sell it and market it. But I knew a friend of mine in acting school whose first cousin was Dustin Hoffman. And I said to him one time, I said, why don't you call him? He goes, because I'm not ready to call him. He goes, yeah, he could get me an audition. He goes, but I'm not ready for that. And I think that's exactly right. If you're in a position, if somebody at Random House reads your book, that actually happens, and they're going to review it to see you to publish it, and it's not ready, what a waste of time.
Yeah.
What a waste of a golden opportunity.
Right. Save it till it can count.
Yeah.
Barry, it's been great talking to you, but of course it always is. And we'll have to get you back here when the novel comes out. But thank you for being on the podcast.
And thank you for publishing my work.
Absolutely. All right, then, a few parting words before we sign off. Again, don't forget to register for WriterCon, which takes place Labor Day weekend, September 3rd through 6th. And the website is writercon.org, WRITERCON.org. Let me also remind you that this podcast is ad-free for a reason. It's supported by our patrons. I've got a site at Patreon that's patreon.com/Wilbern, first 4 letters of both of my names, WILLBERN, where you can support this podcast. And believe me, even a small contribution makes a big difference. Please rate or review this show wherever you get your podcasts. It makes it easier for new listeners to find us and is very much appreciated. So until next time, sneakers, keep writing. Like Barry says, make yourself sit down and write. And remember, you cannot fail if you refuse to quit. See you next time.